So I wanted in this presentation to talk a bit about what Alberta is doing in relation to wild boar, but also to start out, Brooke and I kind of decided I would give a quick overview of wild boar as well for everyone joining, because lots of people might be invasive species folks and not necessarily wild boar folks. So I wanted to start out by talking about sort of how we talk about wild boar, what we call them. So really the main message here is they're all one species, Suscrofa. The Eurasian wild boar, that classic sort of old world Russian wild boar on the left there. That's the ancestor for all of our domestic pig breeds today. So everyone sort of became descended from that wild boar, and the ancestor is still here today. Uh, and the domestic pig breeds can be quite variable. So there's a few pictures from Alberta of pigs that we get reported through our wild boar reporting. And then because everybody is the same species, they all can interbreed. And so we have a lot of hybridization. And so you have this range from the sort of pure genetics, Eurasian wild boar, all the way down to domestic breeds and everything in between. And how we talk about wild boar and the genetic makeup of wild pigs is varies geographically. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about that. This is a bit of a Franken map, and it is kind of older data, especially on the Canadian side, but I think the message is still the same. So feral swine is the term that often gets used in the United States for wild pigs. And I think that comes from the idea that initially pigs came to the US with the colonizers, and they were mostly domestic breeds that were brought for food and allowed to free range, and they established populations of feral domestic breed pigs. And that's been a large component of the US feral swine genetics. They did have Eurasian wild boar brought over later for hunting and meat production, and then those pigs all interbred and hybridized. But mainly in the US, it's more domestic genetics than what we see here in Canada. Our wild pigs or wild boar came to Canada a lot later. We didn't really have the influx of the early domestic breeds. We just had the arrival of Eurasian wild boar in the 1980s for livestock diversification. And so particularly on the prairies, a lot of our wild pigs are closer in genetic makeup to the Eurasian wild boar. And then I think we do see other wild pigs, like potbelly pigs are more prevalent in Ontario and BC, and those are some of the wild pigs that they struggle with. So we've gone with wild pigs in Canada. That's sort of the term the national strategy is taken on. In Alberta, we talk about wild boar because that's how they're defined in our legislation. And so that's sort of what I'm used to using. But you can really see it's a whole mix of a lot of different genetics and different sources and stories of how wild pigs came to be in different parts of the world. In Alberta, I think this map is relatively tells a good story of where we have our wild pig, wild boar problems. And even though there's been some changes since 2017, which is when this particular map came about, I think the similar picture is happening there. So how to recognize wild boar and their sign. Wild boar differ from the domestic pig in that they tend to be taller and shorter in body. So they have the taller shoulders and the narrower hips, where our domestic breeds have been bred to have sort of a more cylindrical shape, shorter legs and bigger hams for the meat production. They also have that really classic facial profile of a straight, elongated snout. You can see really the difference there in the skull shape of the wild boar versus the domestic pig. Their coat is a lot thicker, often dark, although of course with the hybridization, you could have a variety of coat colors. And one distinguishing feature of the juveniles is that they have striped piglets. And there's one domestic breed, the Mangalitsa pig, that also has striped juveniles. But other than that, those stripes would be indicative of some wild boar genetics in there. In terms of their sign, their tracks are really similar to deer tracks. But if the hoof print isn't really clear or the snow has been melted a bit or whatever, it can be difficult to distinguish between the two. So often the tracks may not be a really conclusive evidence of wild boar. And similarly with scat, their scat can be very variable because they're omnivores. And so it's often, you can be sort of squinting at tracks and scat and wondering if it's wild boar or not. So some signs that wild boar are around is often better to look at their impact on the land. And one sign that you'll see if wild boar are around is wallowing. This is The wallows are created by the boars wallowing to stay cool and to protect themselves from parasites. And they have a lot of impact on the water quality of those wetland areas. They can increase turbidity, and contamination is introduced as wild boar will pee and poop in their wallows. And it really damages that sensitive wetland habitat that a lot of species rely on. Something else that will be pretty evident if wild boar are around is rooting. This is one of the ways that wild boar forage for food, and it can range from pastures that are really rooted up and look like they've been rototilled all the way down to just sort of small scrapings in the ground. This is also quite a destructive behavior. The wild boar are kind of trampling and destroying the vegetation. They're also compacting the soil, increasing the chance of soil erosion, and also increasing the chance for other invasive species to establish in these rooted areas. So very destructive. This is a good chance to talk a bit about the diet. Wild boar are omnivores, and I think anything that fits in their mouth will be eaten. So they can eat lots of things underground, like roots and tubers and shoots through the rooting. They'll also consume any part of the plant, lots of seeds, berries, nuts, all the leaves. They eat a lot of our small wildlife, so insects, earthworms, amphibians, eggs of anything that's on the ground, small mammals, and they do eat carrion. So they will eat carrion, and also they've been known to predate on juvenile livestock, so young. So really they eat anything. And I think that's maybe all I had to say about eating. Something else you could come across if wild boar are around are nests. So they use these nests for raising their young, but then also just for short-term bedding. These are both photos that came from Alberta. So the larger one was probably used for raising young, and then the smaller one is more of a bed site. Which is a good opportunity to talk about their life cycle. They reproduce very quickly. The groups are called founders, and it's usually made up of several females and multiple generations of their young. The males tend to be solitary or in small groups of males. And the group sizes can range for the sounders with the females from 2 to 3 all the way up to 20 plus. So very variable. The females can become reproductive at around 13 months or potentially sooner if there's good food availability. And they can reproduce multiple times a year. And on average, they're having around 6 piglets per litter. So the reproductive potential of these species of wild boar is huge compared to a lot of our native species. So really, hopefully that kind of summarizes wild boar a little bit, and that you're left with the understanding that they're one of the most damaging invasive species in North America. We talked about the rooting and wallowing behaviors that can damage habitat quality. And I put here just to remind myself to talk about the impacts on agriculture as well, that they really impact agriculture at all stages of growth of the plant. So we have evidence of wild boar coming in after seeding and consuming the seed. And then also right at the end of the plant's life cycle, a lot of folks in Alberta feed their cattle through standing corn over the winter, and wild boar like that as well because it provides them a food source and a habitat for the winter. They compete with and eat our native wildlife, and they carry a lot of diseases of concern for humans, livestock, and wildlife. And so one of particular concern right now is African swine fever. This is something that's been spreading throughout the world. It has not arrived in North America yet, but there's a lot of activities underway to prepare and prevent for that arrival. The reason that this would be so destructive is that it would be a huge impact to the pork industry. And in Canada, we export about 70% of our pork. And so if that market were to close, there would be it would be quite damaging to that industry. All right, so shifting a little bit to talking about our program in Alberta, we, along with the rest of the prairies, received our wild boar in the 1980s through farm diversification initiatives. And relatively early on, like probably in the late 90s, people started to realize that there was a bit of a problem. And so they were listed as a pest under the Agricultural Pest Act. And there was some efforts underway to kind of handle that, but it was realized probably around 2015 that some provincial program was needed to deal with this complex pest species. And so that's when Perry Abramenko sort of took on that challenge, and he developed a wild boar strategy and pilot project for Alberta. And he spent a lot of time talking to folks in the US about what they'd been doing and what had been working for them. And he really tried to take all of those successful tools and bring them back to Alberta. So that's when our trapping program started. And at first it was just Perry out trapping. And we also introduced minimum containment standards for the wild boar farms we have here to prevent additional escapes. And then in 2022, that culminated in our wild boar control program, which is a permanent program and is kind of meant to be the sister program of the rat control program in Alberta. And so it was right around that time that Perry felt like he'd done his job to get us to a good place, and he retired. And Susan and I showed up to try to carry on that program. And that was also when the Alberta Invasive Species Council really started with the Squeal on Pigs campaign in Alberta. So the messaging and the awareness around wild boar in Alberta really increased around that time. So just to look at what sort of control was going on throughout this whole time frame, there was an ear bounty program early on that happened, and really that program ended. Interest in the program was waning. Wild boar were still on the landscape, and when Perry did a lot of his work, a lot of the recommendations from other jurisdictions were to focus on whole sounder trapping. So that program ended. Our professional trapping program running since 2018, we now have 2 folks with Alberta Pork that are part of that trapping team. And they've removed 367 wild boar since 2018. And I just put an asterisk there because those are whole sounders that they've been removing. And so that's very different than what was removed during the ear bounty program. That would have just been individuals or perhaps a few from a group, but not the whole group. And so I think that the advantage of removing the whole sounder for control and long-term success is really there. And then we did have a modified bounty program introduced with the 2022 wild boar control program, which has not really been a successful program. So in terms of the status of wild boar management in Alberta right now, they're designated as a pest, which means landowners have to prevent the establishment and control them. This does mean, because they're not wildlife, that it is legal to hunt wild boar in Alberta anywhere in the province, and there's no license or season required. But people do have to follow rules about firearm use under the Wildlife Act and, of course, get permission to access land. And then I also wanted to highlight that in Alberta, escaped domestic pigs are not pests, they're stray animals. And so under the Stray Animals Act, they are captured under that. So you're not able to shoot escaped domestic pigs. We have the Squeal on Pigs campaign since 2022. That's really led by the Alberta Invasive Species Council, and this has been really successful in getting the message out and increasing our public reporting of wild boar sightings. We have the professional whole sounder trapping that's led by Alberta Pork. We do have 1 month left of a whole sounder trapping incentive bounty program. Wild boar are listed under the Wildlife Damage Compensation Program so that farmers that are experiencing wild boar damage could be having insurance claims for that. This hasn't really been particularly utilized by folks. It's been around for 2 years. I think there's probably some more promotion that has to happen around this program. But there's lots of reasons why people might not apply for insurance for damage. And so we're just not really seeing this happening, even though we know through anecdotal reports that farmers are experiencing wild boar damage in some of our infested areas. I mentioned we do have wild boar farms. There's 14 that we're aware of for meat production and hunting, and we inspect those annually to make sure they're meeting the containment standards. We have a large wild pig research project in partnership with the University of Calgary and Dr. Mathieu Prévost that started. It's been going about a year. There's 3 students involved in that project, all looking at different aspects of wild boar and disease and livestock interactions. But through that, we're also hoping to get some information about wild boar density in some of our infested areas. And then we're really involved with African swine fever response preparedness. So lots of things going on in Alberta with respect to wild boar management. And I just wanted to share sort of, the topic of this webinar was really about regional approaches. And so I wanted to share a bit about our approach to what I hope will be successful wild boar management in Alberta. I've been around for about a year and a half. This is what I try to keep in mind when I come to work, and I'm hoping it's going to pay off for us. So the first is to focus on the goal. There's a lot of different and exciting work that can happen out there, but really we need to make sure everything ties back to our goal, which is to mitigate the threat of wild boar to Alberta. We want to learn from others. A big toolbox is going to be needed, so building that toolbox is important. Filling knowledge gaps so that we can make good decisions about management. We want to collaborate and participate, particularly participating on the many wild boar working groups and African swine fever planning groups that there are. It's really valuable to sort of have Alberta at the table and aware of what's going on and connecting with other folks that are working in the same direction. We want to keep the human dimensions in mind. I think that for this species especially, it can be very controversial and very polarizing. And to keep in mind that not everyone thinks the same way about wild boar. People are willing to tolerate different things when it comes to wild boar, and people are willing to tolerate different control methods when it comes to wild boar. And so I think if you have a great program and you have strong legislation and you have good enforcement, but you haven't really thought about the human dimension, then you're always going to be fighting an uphill battle. So really for this program, I think that's important. And then educating at all levels. And I have a few asterisks because I just wanted to sort of dive into those a little bit more. So the first is really learning from others. And I would say bring home what others have learned and adapt it to your own spot. And I just need to really highlight the USDA here in the US. This group of people, I've reached out to them to ask questions about so many different topics. And everyone I've talked to has been really helpful and really collaborative and full of good information. They're just doing a huge amount of work in the US on wild pigs. And, not all of it can directly apply to Canada, but a lot of it does. And so there's just so much. Like we've learned, our initial program was really built on a lot of the learnings that they had, and we've tried to continue that. Our focus on whole sounder trapping came from talking to them. We've applied a lot of the eDNA detection techniques based on that. We're having some help with kind of getting some more work on drones, collaring, like all these things. There's so much information there. Then closer to home in Canada, we have some really great partners as well. Ontario sort of had a really nice wild pig strategy, and I often look to that to think about our strategy in Alberta and trying to put together a nice comprehensive picture of what we're trying to do and really communicate that to people. And then, of course, our partners on the prairies, their climate is close to us. They share the similar wild boar as us. And kind of learning from them, we've had lots of great collaborations with our partners on the prairies, as well as gleaning a lot of information from the work that Ryan Brook has done over the years at the University of Saskatchewan. And a lot of our partners in academia are working with him, and so there's lots of great connections happening there. And then closer to home in Alberta, we have a great trapping team, and they have a lot of knowledge. When you think about going from macro levels of collaring and looking at habitat and GIS layers, and then right down to these two people that are out there every day following our wild boar around and figuring out a lot about their behavior and what's needed to capture them. So we get a lot of really great information from them. And then working with Elk Island National Park, which is the first park to have wild boar in their park. And a lot of the skills they bring are so different from what we have. And so that's been really valuable. So I think really just there's a lot out there and there's no need to reinvent the wheel, although you might have to tweak it for your own climate. I think one gap here that I really haven't gotten going in Alberta is connecting with our European colleagues. Wild boar in Europe are quite a different story, but they've also been struggling for a long time, and especially some of the things they're learning around African swine fever would be very valuable. I think the next message is really there's no silver bullet. The toolbox needs to be deep for these critters. So far, our current approach really is focused on whole sounder trapping and public reports. And I think we really need to expand that. We have some other things that we started to bring in, but I wouldn't say we're sort of proficient with yet. And then I think there's things we haven't really started to play with at all yet, but are being used in other jurisdictions and are going to be necessary for us to get ahead of this challenging species. I think also the message is that it's going to take a village, as is the case with, I'd say, most invasive species. No one organization or person is going to be able to deal with that invasive species, and that's very true for wild boar. in Alberta, we have a really collaborative approach. The Alberta Government, Alberta Pork, and the Alberta Invasive Species Council really are kind of in lockstep and working on this issue together. We all bring different strengths and have different connections. But then we've really made an effort to connect with all of our other partners in tackling wild boar and bringing them in through a wild boar forum. We've had one of now meetings, one-on-one discussions, presentations to their groups. And I think this is a real strength of what we've been able to do in Alberta. You can maybe hear my detection dog in the background. So I think this is really an important message that we're not going to be able to do it alone. And so we need to bring everyone in. And I think this has been very successful for other invasive species, particularly in my history working on zebra and quagga mussels. And so I think that's the approach that we need to take here. And then the last thing is really to get everyone talking about wild boar. You know, we give a lot of presentations. We have a lot of information that we give out. We have a website. The Alberta Invasive Species Council does a fantastic job promoting the Squeal on Pigs campaign. So I think that's going well, and we just need to keep it up. Then there's kind of in the middle there, people are going to go and take your message and talk about it amongst themselves. They're going to listen to media, talk on social media, sort of figure out what they think. And I think it's great to have people talking about wild boar with their neighbors, and that's how things kind of change and move ahead. But then I think we also need to remember we have to talk about wild boar to the legislators and the decision makers and the politicians. I think they need to have good information about what's going on, what's at risk, what are we doing, and so that they can bring that into making their decisions. And I think that's one area where I'm really trying to focus is we have really good public outreach and education, but what about our decision makers, and how do we get them talking about wild boar and them wearing Squeal on Pigs hats and them, you know, interested in these things. So that's sort of my quick overview of our program. There's certainly lots of things going on, and I'm really happy for anyone to contact me after this presentation with other questions. And so then I think I will pass it over to Brook so that he can share what's been happening in Ontario.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, thank you, Hannah. Thank you for that. And also thank you for the shout out early on in your presentation. You know, I think a lot of the stuff that you were talking about in terms of collaboration is echoed by me and my organization, the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. We try to work collectively with all sorts of different groups on a variety of topics, including invasive species. And for those of you who aren't aware, the Ontario Federation is Ontario's largest not-for-profit fish and wildlife conservation organization in Ontario, with 100,000 members, subscribers, and supporters, including 725 membership clubs. And, you know, obviously, as an organization who has a membership focused on angling and hunting, we represent a group of people who can, you know, bring light to the issue of wild pigs. And right off the hop, I want to make it clear that it's really important to understand that in Ontario, we are just one little piece of that puzzle in terms of invasive species work as well as wild pigs. And you know, the real efforts being undertaken in regards to wild pigs are being spearheaded by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, or the MNRF. And we work to, you know, again, fill one piece of that puzzle and to complement them as much as humanly possible in their, you know, their efforts to ensure that Ontario continues to be wild pig free. So with that, I'll jump into my slides here. Okay. There we go. So I just want to start off real quick about giving you guys some context around who we are. So the Invading Species Awareness Program was started in 1992, and it's a partnership program between the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, our host organization, and the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And it was really instigated by the introduction of zebra mussels to Ontario. And our program since then, since the early 90s, has focused on generating education and awareness related to invasive species, both aquatic and terrestrial. And my background, though broadly been focused on aquatics, everything from invasive carps to crayfishes to snails, has also been focused on wild pigs. And you know, I've been a hunter since I was 6 years old. I am one of those people who reap the benefits of being able to hunt and having access and enjoying moose hunting, deer hunting, bear hunting, wild turkey hunting, and recognize that wild pigs would be, you know, a significant threat to many species in Ontario, as well as agriculture, as well as many other, you know, areas in Ontario. So I have kind of a vested interest in making sure that Ontario remains wild pig free. Moreover, we also facilitate monitoring and early detection for the province, and this is where we kind of slot in today with our monitoring program. And we have the invading species hotline, which you see across the bottom there, 1-800-563-7711, Monday to Friday. We receive anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 phone calls every year related to invasive species, and I'll talk about some of the wild pig reports that we get a little bit later. Again, just helping to collaborate with MNRF to ensure that people have multiple options for reporting wild pigs, so that when those reports are made, we can get that information to our partners at the MNRF, so hopefully they can rapidly respond to any potential wild pig, sighting. Now, I think it is important to say, though, that Ontario is, technically wild pig free currently. We do not have any established populations of wild pigs. We do have, pigs on the landscape here and there, and predominantly we are seeing mostly escapees. So, pot-bellied pigs from farms, let's say. But we are working to ensure that it stays that way. You saw that map early on that Hannah showed, and you can see that there's some wild pig populations just adjacent to us in Manitoba, and potentially threatening to cross the border into northern Ontario. And then you see some populations, pockets here and there in Ontario, and then you also see some to the east. So we want to make sure that we have eyes on the landscapes to ensure that when a wild pig is detected, that people know to report it, first of all. And when they do report it, that we're able to rapidly respond in such a way to, find those pigs and remove them from the landscape. And we are not part of that, that actual physical removal process. That's where the MNRF comes in. But we are very much some of the folks on the front lines, receiving those phone calls, receiving those emails, and as well as running our wild pig surveillance program, again, to help complement all that work. So that goes into my last point, which is supporting management, control, and response. We've worked on a variety of species, everything from an aquatic invasive plant called water soldier to the invasive marble crayfish, which has been all over the media recently, which we found down in Burlington, and we're working collaboratively to try to eradicate. And then, wild pigs and invasive carps, all sorts of invasive carps that you see behind me here. We've worked on a variety of management, control, and response with our partners over the years. So I want to make it very clear, the OFAH wild pig objective is to prevent the establishment of wild pig, populations in Ontario. I think that is in the best interest of all people, hunters, anglers, farmers, everyday people. It's in all of our best interests. It's in the best interest of biodiversity, the well-being of our environments, to ensure that we do not have wild pigs roaming freely in our ecosystems. So I just want to show you here a few of the social media posts that the OFAH has put out over the years. And, just talking about what is a wild pig, because again, with our 100,000 members, subscribers, and supporters, a lot of them being hunters, I think we all know on this call, if you're kind of involved in the wild pig conversation, that there's maybe a little bit of diversity in terms of what people think around wild pigs. There's a very strong group of people who think that hunting wild pigs would be a great opportunity. And as a hunter, it's like, okay, yeah, you can hunt a wild pig potentially someday, but right now in Ontario, that is prohibited. You're not allowed to do that. And what that means is if you are hunting wild pigs, there's a pretty good chance you're going to spread those pigs. There are many case studies, especially from the States, that has shown that when you combine hunting with small populations of pigs, it can lead to larger populations of pigs. So, we came out with our stance pretty early on, science-based. We are a science-based organization, and science has shown that hunting will lead to expanding pig populations. So we want to support the MRF in their, stance and their perspective on wild pigs, which is we should not be hunting them. And then, so these are, again, just some of the posts that we've been putting on social media. So even just as simple as what is a wild pig? Because even that, Hannah went over that quite a bit. And it's a really important topic because people don't really understand that they're all the same species, right? So they think a Eurasian boar is potentially a different species than a pot-bellied pig, but that's just simply not the case. And it shows, it shows to people that pot-bellied pigs can be a threat if allowed to roam on the landscape, establish, and start reproducing. And then finally, why is hunting not the solution? Again, science-based. You look at the case studies, everything suggests that hunting them is not a good idea. There are some limited case studies where hunting has been used as a control method, and that's all well and good. But en masse, it just simply is not the answer. So where do we come in? Back in 2021, the Green Shovels Collaborative, which is an informal coalition of conservation organizations, you see them listed here. This group of organizations came together to offer a list of shovel-ready projects to the government, to the MNRF. And one of those projects was a wild pig surveillance program, which is the program that I oversee now. And so we were fortunate to receive some of that funding and then be able to create wild pig surveillance kits, which I'll kind of go through here a little bit. I'll show you some photos and whatnot. And so early on, many of the same challenges that Hannah faced, we also faced, right? Hence why we met to talk about some of those challenges. And early on, we wanted to establish goals, expectations. We wanted to address any potential logistical barriers, look to similar projects in the States, surveillance projects, and then consult with partners. And those are some of the key, aspects of then developing the surveillance program that we have now. Moreover, I think we recognized early on that wild pigs really need to be handled by trained personnel, i.e. MNRF. And the reason why is because when you have a sounder of pigs, group of pigs, sounder of pigs, if you have 10 to 12, let's say, you need to make sure that you're capturing all of them. And I think many folks might have seen in the news back a few years ago the sounder that was just outside of Pickering. And it was really important that surveillance is done to determine the size of the sounder, make sure you're capturing all those pigs because these are hyper intelligent creatures, right? And if they're able to escape, a potential capture attempt, there's a pretty good chance that you won't be able to then capture them with the same method the next time, that they'll learn from that experience. So it's really important that you don't just go in there willy-nilly, guns blazing. You want to make sure that you have a trap set that's fed, that they're coming in there regularly before then springing that trap. So we recognize that early on that, it's really important that we have specialized personnel to do that, that the whole sounder needs to be removed, and that we have that partnership with the MNRF so that when those reports do come in, we're able then to get that information to them as quickly as possible. And we do that for a variety of species. We delivering the Invading Species Hotline for Ontario, as well as another tracking tool, which is EDMAPS, or the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping Tool, mapping system for Ontario, is another method with which the Ontario public can report invasive species to us. So we get all sorts of, invasive carps, or, this past year, we received the first report of oak wilt in the province of Ontario, and we were the ones that facilitated gathering that information and passing it off to the powers that, need to know that. And then CFIA was able to rapidly respond to that. So, we play that part in being kind of that middleman between the public and many of our government entities to ensure that there's a smooth process, that, that information gets to us. We're able to disseminate that information and then pass it to the folks who need to know. So early on, we're like, okay, we need to recruit people. We want a surveillance program. We want people, just everyday people to set up cameras in some select regions. We determine the regions based on meetings with the MNRF. They've got a great crew over there. They always meet with me. We always talk about annual kind of priorities. Okay, where's the priorities this year? And so early on, we determined, okay, Lanark and Parry Sound regions in year one were kind of the main priorities back in 2021. So we started with some social media. We started on ISAP, so the Invading Species Awareness Program social media, and the OFH social media, to get that stuff out there, to start elevating, people's understanding around wild pigs, to then start getting them, primed for recruitment to become volunteers. Then we started building the kit. We created stickers. We created documents to help people choose sites, to look for that sign that Hannah talked about, to look for tracks, to look for anything that could be discerned as potential wild pig sign on the landscape, so then they could then deploy their surveillance camera kits there. Then, in the height of COVID, in my basement of my house, I started building the kits, which you see here. Ignore the alcohol on the left. And we started, putting the kits together, started, making everything that would be needed minus bait. It was put on the individual volunteer to purchase bait locally. It just wasn't economical for us to, either purchase and ship bait. We did offer some money here and there for folks who just, said like, I can't afford, a 10 to $20 bag of bait. So, okay, we'll give that to you. But by and large, most of them were totally fine with providing their own bait, because many of our volunteers early on were hunters, and they're like, well, I see an opportunity to both look for wild pigs as well as, use this camera to maybe look for other wildlife. And in so doing, generating that conversation amongst their friends about the program and about wild pigs. So this was the first iteration of the kit. Then we moved on to a much more solid version of the kit, mainly because those yellow totes just all got destroyed in transit. But they would come back like in pieces. So went to a more heavy duty kit, one that would not get destroyed in transit. And we got that back in 2022, which was pretty nice. And then we were really fortunate to develop a partnership with OMAFRA, so the Ontario Ministry on Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. And this side of the program allowed us to generate 30 kits. I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but the first Green Shovels program had 50, so now up to 80 kits. And these 30 kits were really focused on pork producers and individuals who, farm pigs in Ontario. It was a bit more of a challenge. Did find that there was a pretty slow uptake from pig producers. I don't think they necessarily a lot of them just didn't have the time. And when I spoke to them on the phone, they said, look, like I'm a busy person, I don't really have the time to be doing this, checking the cameras. So I was like, okay, that's understandable, but if you know somebody who will, let us know. So as of right now, there are 14 of these kits deployed on the landscape by pork producers, and there is a plan in place to use those 16 kits this year because there's no point in them sitting around, in storage. So we're going to get them deployed on the Quebec side of, Eastern Ontario. Again, because if we looked at that map that Hannah showed, there is a possibility of pigs coming from the east. What was really great about this, though, is it developed a partnership between us and Ontario Pork, and I've worked with them quite a bit. They've started to advertise the wild pig issue to their membership, as well as helping us recruit pork producers for this part of the program. It also allowed us to create an explainer video, which you can find on our website, invadingspecies.com, which is me basically in my backyard. It's really well produced. I know that doesn't sound like it is, but my former colleague, Chase, he's an amazing cameraman, and we did an entire video on how to deploy the kit, how to choose a site, how to bait the site, et cetera, et cetera. So then in year one, I'm just going to go over the years, kind of stats real quick. I don't want to take up too much time. So the first year, it kind of shows you, it's a bit sporadic. It didn't get as many volunteers as we would have liked. I really expected more, but so this was kind of almost all of the volunteers that we got. We did put out a specific call for like Lanark area and then Parry Sound area, again, areas that were identified as potentially high risk. And you see some of the stats there. We had a super high amount of impressions online only because we were sharing and boosting posts, both from the OFH perspective, but then also from the ISAP perspective. And the real good news here is that we had 0 actual wild pigs detected. We had 1 suspect, but I think it was determined to be a raccoon. And then we also had 34 wild pig reports to ISAP. So elevating that knowledge in Ontario, right, is generating those reports. Then we move into 2022. The blue spots are people who applied. So you can see like we had a real surge in second year for applicants. But that year we decided in tandem with the MNRF that we were going to deploy our cameras in the north, right? North, Manitoba, potential, population. We don't want them spreading into Ontario. We need eyes in the north, but we also need representation and people talking in Northern Ontario. So that's what this did, right? We started having those conversations with folks in the north to ensure that they were talking to their friends. And we had a number of new recruits come forward and say, hey, like my buddy was talking about how he's part of this wild pig surveillance program. I've got acreage, I wouldn't mind receiving a kit. Absolutely. And so word of mouth was getting out there, right? So you see, we also did more social media stuff, digital engagement, and we had another 50 volunteers. It was always challenged from year to year as to whether we were going to get all the kits back because we never know where we're going to be deploying, right? So you can't just leave kits with the volunteers. And, we didn't necessarily have the funds to just replace, all kits. So it was a matter of, sending them the kits, having them deploy it for those key months, and then they are checking the camera regularly for wild pigs, but then they also send it back to us. Then we check the cameras again for wild pigs. And then we, clean the kits, we do an inventory, and then we choose the next year where we're going to go. It just so happened between 2022 and 2023, we actually did choose the same region. And we had a really great group in the north of volunteers. We got most kits back the year prior in 2022. So we chose the folks who gave us the kits back, obviously, and then got those kits sent up there. Again, and we also partnered with a few different groups. I was able to partner with Métis Nation of Ontario to get a few folks to deploy some cameras. And then we also partnered with Nature Conservancy of Canada, so NCC, on their lands to get some cameras up in that region as well. Again, good year, no pigs. You might see that as, well, that's not successful. Well, that's what we want. We don't want to be successful. I don't want to find wild pigs, but if the cameras are up there and again, people are talking about it, if there is a pig, we're hoping that it comes through to us. But ultimately, good news story is not seeing pigs, because that's exactly what we want. We don't want to see them. Here are some of the photos. I apologize if you're squeamish. This was a dead wild pig that was reported to us. These are some of the photos that we've received over the years to the program. You can see some pretty clear ones. The bottom center one, you really see that snout that Hannah was describing, like that kind of elongated snout, versus the dead pig on the right, which is kind of that compressed face, which is more indicative of like a pot-bellied pig. So getting a wide variety of pigs here, you see kind of more of those pinkish pigs in the background there, in the center top, or sorry, I guess the top right photo, and then you have a sounder in the top left photo. So we've gotten a variety of these photos over the years. Every single time we do, again, we make sure we disseminate that information and then pass it off to the MRF. Now, one really important thing that we've been able to do in Ontario is get a lot of media coverage. And I think, wild pigs are a hot topic. They're a large animal. They would represent some, extreme impacts to Ontario. We have lots of agriculture. We have lots of wild game. We have lots of, we have a rich biodiversity. So it's a hot topic. And I've been very fortunate to be able to speak to the issue a number of times. The top left was CBC Thunder Bay, and then top right was CBC London, and both a few years back. But over the years, I've had a number of conversations with whether it's CBC or in this case, the one on the right there is Cottage Life. So it's really important that we talk about wild pigs and that we're able to get this information out to the media. And I'll show you why in the next slide. But here's a few others that just happened in the last month. Tor Buchanan, who works with the MNRF and the wild pig crew there, and I were both interviewed by City TV, and we did a fairly lengthy piece on wild pigs. It was a little sensational, but it's okay because we get the wording out there, we get the message out there, and it's really important. And then also, I was interviewed by Brandon Sun out of Manitoba, talking about wild pigs just recently. So it's really good, and it's really important that we do that, because this is a slide that was provided to me by Bree from the MNRF. There is a direct correlation between wild pig reports and media coverage. So the more we talk to the media, the more people see it. The more people see it, the more they understand that this is an issue, the more they report it. The more they report it, the more that the MNRF or other powers that be across Canada are able to get out there and rapidly respond to this invasive species. So media is important, and we do everything we can to get that messaging out there, talk to the media, tell them what's going on, tell them the truth, and ensure that they are reporting on this so that people in Ontario are in the know about, if you see a pig, report that pig. In this case, squeal on pigs. So lessons learned, I'm going to my last few slides here. Lessons learned, I mean, this is a slide I've had for a number of years. I've learned these lessons over and over and over again with the wild pig surveillance program. And I mean, some of these are kind of ridiculous, but these are things that I've learned in the program in terms of just trying to make sure that it's delivered well. And I think the main thing is having that open line of communication with your volunteers, making sure that they're aware of what their expectations are, and making sure that they're passionate, right? Like, it's really easy for somebody to put their name in the hat to get a camera for 6 months, but it's another thing to have somebody who's actually genuinely passionate about the environment, about making sure that Ontario is wild pig free. So yeah, it's been a learning experience. It's been great though. As I said, we have great volunteers, and this year for 2024, we are focusing again in the Northwest. So we'll be looking to get more cameras up there, as well as sending some cameras to the east. And again, these were decisions that came to be through collaboration with our provincial government. So thank you so much. I want to thank CCIS. I want to thank Gabby, as well as Hannah, for working on wild pigs, as well as inviting me to speak about our perspective on wild pigs, both from a program and an organizational perspective, and how we fit into that piece of the pie in terms of Ontario and what we're doing to try to prevent wild pigs from being established on our landscapes. If you'd like to get in touch with me at all, here's my email, brook_Schryer@ofh.org. Additionally, you can email info@invadingspecies.com, and you can report by calling 1-800-563-7711 or admaps.org. Thanks so much.